Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Brian Boyles. I'm Executive Director of Mass Humanities. So excited for tonight's event. This is the latest in a series of conversations that we are doing with people that work in the humanities all around the country. Tonight, I'm really happy to have my colleague and friend Anthony Poore, Executive Director of the New Hampshire Humanities Council, here with us tonight. Anthony, how are you?
Can you hear me?
I gotcha.
All right, thank you, sir. I am doing well, my man. How are you tonight?
I'm good.
Glad to hear it.
It's always good to get a chance to talk with you. Just for some context for people, there's a state humanities council in all 50 states, as well as several of our territories. We're all affiliates to the National Endowment for the Humanities, and as someone who's been a student of the council world for quite some time now, we're at a very interesting juncture, and that's part of the reason that I wanted to bring on Anthony. Over the last couple of years, there's really been just a huge turnover in the leadership of councils all across the country. Anthony and I both came in 2018, and what I think is significant about this is we're all coming into different states and different roles as far as how we impact the places we live. Some of us are following legendary directors who had been there for quite a long time, as I am. Others are following different tracks. But what's been really interesting for me to see is that people are coming from a variety of different backgrounds. So we have people coming from communications, we have people coming from social justice, we have people that have worked in finance. Anthony kind of represents part of what I think is interesting about this change, in that he was just formerly the director of regional community outreach at the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston, so he knows a good deal about Massachusetts, and before that was an assistant dean at Southern New Hampshire University. And the conversation I want to have tonight with him is to really hear, from his perspective, how things are going. We've obviously live in a challenging time as a nation, and each of these organizations is responding in different ways. And I think Anthony brings a really good perspective. We've had a lot of great conversations, and I'm really just interested in talking tonight, I think, about what it means to lead during a time like this, and individually what the council is doing in New Hampshire to respond to the things that are coming at us almost daily in our lives. We will take some questions at the end of the conversation. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes. We'll continue to let people in as they come. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter as we do this work, and we'll post a link at the end, but we will be putting this up on YouTube so you guys can watch again or pass it on to other people. So Anthony, that's my kickoff. So I wanted to start because I do think you bring a really interesting mix of skill set to this position. Just to ask how you came to the humanities in New Hampshire as your next stage in your career.
Well, thanks. Well, first of all, Brian, thanks for having me, and thank you for allowing me to share a bit of my truth and just really engage with everybody here. And so I'm hoping and praying really that we can engage in the conversation with everybody here throughout this entire 45 minutes or throughout it. A little bit about me. I grew up from fairly humble beginnings. I'm the product of a mixed marriage, if you will. I just turned 50, half a century, look out, kid of the 70s. Grew up in Dayton, Ohio. I'm a Rust Belt kid, if you will. We had a traditional root, not traditional, but product of a single mother, worked hard, figured it out, put myself through school. As such, I bring this working class attitude to everything that I do. I may not be the smartest cat in the world, but I can outwork you. That being said, I also knew that I like people more than I like things growing up as a kid. And I find that that's true of my career path that I chose. So I started my career as a social worker, got my first degree in social work. I went on to pursue additional graduate work at Masters in Science and Community Economic Development, and also a Masters in Business Administration. It gave me an opportunity to leverage my business acumen. Because one of the things that of interest to me, I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. In Dayton, Ohio, for those of you who are on this call, is an old model city. It was called a model city. And for those who are familiar with model cities, it was an early form of local government. So I grew up around priority boards and block clubs and neighborhood associations. And they were really the early seeds for me to look at issues of circulation of wealth within communities. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Dayton, Ohio, like many communities of color, we all happen to live on the west side of the river, and all those of European descent lived on the east side. And so it was always of interest to me. I looked at our wealth within our community, how it would circulate. And so my granddaddy, I grew up in the church, Greater Allen AME Church. My granddaddy was the treasurer, and he taught me the value of savings. And I was always interested in how wealth circulated within communities, particularly low and moderate income communities. That was the early link. So that being said, I relocated to New Hampshire in 1998 when I just turned 27 because a mentor, Dr. Michael Slack, who's now at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire, had asked me to come up and lead a HUD demonstration project. It was called the Community Outreach Partnership Center. And it gave me the opportunity at the time to leverage my skills in community organizing and community development, particularly economic development. I had just completed a demonstration project for Family Service America at that time. Invited me to come up and start to do this work, but particularly the growing and emerging communities of color here in downtown Manchester at the time, and particularly some of our newer Americans. And so over time, I spent time at the school, did additional graduate work, and then from there, it became an assistant dean, which gave me an opportunity to really work in higher ed and kind of understand that piece and kind of deepen my interest in research. From there, I transitioned over to the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, working and helping to lead our community development efforts there, which gave me a regional focus as well. And so, but my particular focus, sir, was on the northern tier. And so if you think about New England, I often think about it as the northern and the southern tiers. You know, if you think about the northern tier, I call it Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. In fact, joined together by the northern forest, if you will. And our economic history is predicated much on what I call the 3Fs, the farming, the fishing, and the forestry. Where if you look at the southern tier, we had, you know, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, if you will, and different economic trajectories that kind of informed your histories as well. And so from there, I'd always continued my work though in New Hampshire. I lived in New Hampshire and I commuted back and forth, and it allowed me to also spend time volunteering. And something I've always sought in my personal career was alignment, or what I call symmetry. And there were areas that were always of interest to me that I want to deepen my knowledge base. And I thought one of the ways I could do that was through service. And so the areas of interest to me have been, for example, around affordable housing. And so, for example, for 6 years, I served on the board of directors for NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire, one of 4 NeighborWorks organizations in the state of New Hampshire, the largest provider of affordable housing in the state. I've always had an interest, as I said, in community development finance. And so currently I serve on the board of directors for the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, which is a community development financial institution providing alternative funding mechanisms to working class communities, allowing the regular citizen to invest in themselves as well. I've also had an interest in affordable and education, and particularly affordability and access. My mother pursued her GED at Sinclair Community College. And so I serve on the board of Manchester Community College. I've supported that for a long time. And so now this transition to the humanities, having a deep interest in historically and personally for me in poetry, music, and all these other areas of my other part of my life, which is probably why I enjoy and have so many tattoos probably. But that's another story. We can talk about that as well. But and so this transition into this, which is kind of a natural kind of progression for me. And so it allows me to kind of leverage my own skills and my interests and so on. And so that's just a little bit about me. And oh, by the way, I have 2 beautiful daughters, by the way, Mariana and Daniela. And so I'm also a proud dad and all that other good stuff as well. I can't.
Can you talk about this career that's really built on understanding the flow of money, and then affordable housing being a big part of it? And to me, again, this is why I'm interested in this conversation, is the track from affordable housing to the humanities is not one that's a traditional one, but so much of the work we do as people who run humanities councils is to try to remove barriers, to try and have more equitable access to the resources that are there in the humanities, which is a different world than housing. But I think when we take the kind of global approach we have to things, we see that it's not a different world, and that those barriers prevent people from getting access to housing or loans or actually a good education. Knowing what you knew about New Hampshire when you came into the role in at New Hampshire Humanities, what were the things that for you were barriers that you wanted to try and address so that people could really have more of an engagement with the humanities? Because I think you've done a lot of interesting work in the last 2 years to do that.
Well, I mean, well, I appreciate you saying that, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that, many hands make for light work. And so the reality of the situation is really our program team who's really been driving the work of late, and really since day one. And that's been, Dr. Tricia Pione, Mary Nolan of late, Susan Hayden, and others. So, that's first and foremost, I think I need to lift them up, frankly.
Sure.
But in terms of some of the work, and remind me your question again. I'm sorry, Brian. Forgive me. I got off track.
Well, it was interesting for me coming to Massachusetts from Louisiana, because I really had to learn the landscape in Massachusetts and say to myself, where are the needs, right? Because I do think we share this belief that this work is about that response. What were the needs you knew that were out there that you wanted the humanities to respond to, given, I think, the world that you had been working in?
Got it. Well, I mean, honestly, if you think about New Hampshire, particularly New Hampshire humanities, we've been around darn near 50 years. And the reality of the situation, we've been doing some really good work of late. But I thought that, the kind, the depth and breadth of our work could be different. And we could ensure that our work was accessible to a wider audience. In order for us to do that, we also had to make sure that we broadened our tent. And so the team and I kind of came together and we kind of began to organize around 3 principles. And those principles are around access, innovation, and elevation. So access was to say that no matter who you were, right? Imagine New Hampshire Humanities is a large tent with no walls, but a lot of seats. No matter how big or large your pocketbook size is, who you love, what you look like, your country of origin or the language you speak, there's a seat here for you. And it's our responsibility to make sure that that's always the case. Second of all, a founding kind of core principle or value of us is an idea around innovation, which is not just ensuring that we provide innovative content, so it's both relevant, and we use the lens of the humanities to give focus and a lens to current issues impacting everybody today, right? I don't care if it's the focus on democracy, issue of race and politics, income and wealth inequality, we could go down the list. And those kinds of content. But it's also important that we need to meet people where they're at. That is to say, take the mountain to Muhammad versus assuming that it always has to be the other way. And so we had to make sure that our content was available across multiple platforms. So whether it's a face-to-face back in the day, what I call pre-Rona, or now our pivot to our virtual platforms that we're leveraging now, which we say is really broadened accessibility. We didn't think it'd take on so quick, but luckily it has. And then thirdly, it's around this idea of elevation. It was a recognition that through our role as convener and funder, and ultimately catalyst for positive systems change, that we can really act and through elevation, and that's elevating the work of others, right? Because ultimately, that's how we do our work. It's through working and partnering with others. So we really doubled down on focusing our collaboration and our efforts around the state. For those of you who don't know, New Hampshire is unique in the sense it's almost 4 states in one. North of the Notch, south of the Notch, Seacoast, and the Upper Valley. And so it's important that we reflect the realities on the ground in different areas of the state. And so we've kind of taken those 3 core principles, and that's really driven our work over the past 2 years.
That's interesting, this idea of these 4 different sections, because I think a lot about, what is the culture of Massachusetts? What can I say about it as a characteristic? And I wonder, when you think about New Hampshire, it's very hard to say anybody that everyone has a shared characteristic. But when you think about the people of New Hampshire, I guess what do you say about the people of New Hampshire? Like, what do you feel is if someone had to tell you, had to ask you, as I am, I guess, what New Hampshire's about? You've had a lot of different angles on that question. Where are you at with it right now?
Well, first, I think it's important to note that I, like the majority of people who live in New Hampshire today, weren't born here in the state. I think that's first and foremost interesting to note. We could talk about shifts in population over time, but it's hard to explain because I talked about those 4 regions, and I'm sure we have historians here on this call today, but I think about I spend a lot of time in the North Country. We call it north of the Notch. And I think their economic history and their social histories and their political histories are driven by their economic history largely in paper and pulp. right? And that's really informed our culture. Now, irrespective of the in-migration from the northern tier from French Canadians, you know, if you will. But then you think about the seacoast, you know, their economic history is really tied to the ocean and the sea. You know, Upper Valley is manufacturing and actually farming, which has informed their history and the transient nature of the population that actually go between Vermont and New Hampshire. Often, like we talk where I live in Manchester, Southern Hampshire is actually being Northern Massachusetts, right? And so, you know, it's hard to describe New Hampshire in one word. You know, it's probably four. Now, notwithstanding that, I think one of the interesting things about New Hampshire is its shift in demographic profiles, you know, which most people don't think about. So we talk about access to the humanities, right? We also want to make sure that our work, both in its content and delivery, reflects the interests of the demographic we're intended to serve. So as a statewide organization, we have to be thinking about, well, although statewide, you know, Black and brown people may only represent 10% of the state's population. My daughter attends a majority minority school here in Manchester, New Hampshire, Central High School, the oldest and largest public high school in the state of New Hampshire, right? And so we need to think about, we have content that reflects the stories, much like our vision, and that kind of guides the organization, you know, making sure that the stories we tell are told accurately, or telling stories that were never told at all. And so that's been driving a lot of our work of late as well. I love to engage others, like what other people are doing. Dr. Pion, I see you out there. Does that resonate with you, Tricia?
They're going to get you in the chat. Don't worry. They're going to
gotcha.
The questions in. I think speaking of stories, the story that I think is important right now is the response of state humanities councils to the CARES Act. So $30 million of the $75 million that was received by the National Endowment for Humanities was then allocated out to the councils. This was sort of a once-in-a-lifetime challenge for the organizations that we represent to not just receive that much funding all in a burst, but have to respond in a pandemic in a time when our cultural institutions are going through, again, a once-in-a-lifetime amount of stress. We were also permitted to offer operating support, which is not something organizations usually do, and not every humanities council does grants as their major thing. So there was a lot of quick thinking that needed to be done. And for me, I think the great story is, as far as I know, within 2 months, you know, checks were out the door from the great majority of councils, including yours and mine, even though we have very, very small staffs, even though we're all going through this experience of living through a pandemic. For me, I learned a lot, I think, in that. One, I learned that I can have a great deal of confidence in my staff. Like I had high opinions of them before, but what they were able to do in that foxhole, as I said to them, to me, that's what being a professional in this field is all about. But at the same time, I learned about the rest of our field, you know, who comes to us at a time of need, and also what their budgets are, what their staff sizes are. A lot of things that, you know, day to day, we don't really think about. CARES Act really gave me just a ton of things to consider when we plan how we want to respond, again, during the pandemic, or hopefully when this thing comes to a conclusion. You guys did quick work, and you presented it really, really well. I really admired the graphics that you guys designed around it. But from a deeper level of, you know, you and your team and what that meant to go through it, and what you found as far as the needs out there that you were trying to serve through that grant making, can you just talk a little bit about the CARES experience? Because again, I've been saying to folks, we shouldn't just let that go past. Like, we need to really honor and commemorate what a big deal this was, because we want more of this kind of support to come through the humanities councils.
Well, not only that, but I think it really did reinforce the important role that, you know, our councils can play in our state, right? If you think about our model, right, in that, you know, we're one of 56 organizations, right? I'm one of 55, so one of 56 organizations spread around the United States, our territories, and so on. And our role is really to reflect, you know, our state's needs, right? And take those up and down to the NEH, to us, and so on. And so first and foremost, I think it really, for me, affirmed the important role we can play in the states in terms of supporting the cultural sector, right, in very tangible ways. Because I think we bring a unique skill set and knowledge base that those who might be in DC, or those who are sometimes even working in our local state offices and municipal level, may not have, because we have a local view, but we also have a statewide view. And I think that's really interesting. So in terms of, just by way of update for those on the call, in terms of our allocation, the state of New Hampshire received $420,000 in terms of our CARES allocation. And I'm proud to say, over a span of 13 business days, we allocated $400,000 of that out. We received 89 applications. We were able to fund 64 of them, positively impacting 48 communities all around New Hampshire. And the type of and the size of organization literally ranged from an annual operating budget of $6,000 per annum, a very small historical society, up to our limit, which was $499,000 per annum, right? Who had applied. Over that, of those that we funded, those 64, they really kind of represented kind of who we serve, our very traditional constituency. So 41% of those were libraries, right? And their need was really interesting, which we can talk about. 27% of them, I'm doing this from memory, so please forgive me, were historical societies. 20% of the remaining represented other cultural organizations, and 13% were museums. So really, and their needs varied. And so, I mean, one of the things we learned was not only was the need so great, and let's be clear, the need still continues because, you know, our local communities are still being impacted by this pandemic. And let me also think about this, given our rural experiences. So think about you know, in your northwest quadrant of your state, up there in the Berkshires, right? That area up there. It's just as rural as some of our rural communities here. For the large part, our local libraries represent the internet hub for our rural communities. And many of our local libraries really depended upon our CARES fund we were provided to allow them to transition to serve their communities and be those hubs, and particularly to support online learning. And so who would have thought at a time at a Humanities Council could support, you know, online learning in the wake of a pandemic, right? And allow our libraries to be the local internet hub. I never would have envisioned that a year ago, right?
Yeah.
Leo? I'm sorry, go ahead. You're going to say something.
Just responding affirmatively, and I think that creativity and the library role was really important to me. Is you know that it's there, but when you really think of it as the portal to how people get resources, not just for the humanities, but in general, they really are the backbone of so many communities.
No, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, you know, some of the resources that were requested, some of the smaller grants. Remember, these grants range in size from $2,000, Brian, up to $10,000. I don't know what y'all had in Massachusetts, so that was our range. And some of our libraries were requesting resources for simple cleaning supplies, right? Because they didn't have the necessary resources to purchase the cleaning supplies and the necessary PPE and masks to open up, right? To organizations who simply, like some of our local historical societies, who frankly were going to lay off staff. Why? Because they have their weekly flea markets on Sunday, which provide the operating income for the year, so they can retain their part-time staff, so they can maintain their historical society, right? And some of our locals, that was, you know, Lancaster as an example. So it's been really interesting, the depth and breadth of need that's out there. But one of the things I just want to always reiterate is the need still continues, you know. And what's been really interesting is as the need continues, I think so it does. It talks about the digital divide. And so many of our libraries and historical societies are trying to struggle. How do they make that pivot, you know, to a traditional face-to-face model to more virtual model? And they don't have the necessary resources, particularly in our property-poor towns here in New Hampshire, or they don't have the necessary expertise to make that pivot. And I think this is another area where we can continue to support the field by doing some necessary field building work to give them the tools necessary to advance, you know, local humanities work, frankly, in support of our missions.
I've been thinking about that a lot, and how, as much as we, again, think about barriers that we need to overcome for people to engage in this work, the digital divide wasn't really on my radar, you know. And then when we start to move to do online programming, realizing that something that we really could do is provide laptops and internet service. And that's not something, again, you think of when you think of a humanities council serving its mission, but it's absolutely crucial if we're really going to engage people who have a need right now. And I think that's the kind of creative thinking we all have to do because the size of this challenge is so big.
Right. I mean, right now, it's one of my biggest struggles, something that kind of keeps me awake at night is really, how do I support the staff of New Hampshire Humanities, and our job is to create an enabling environment that allows them to be successful. And I find it sometimes very frustrating that we're forced to operate in this level of uncertainty. We have to operate in it and with it, right? And support our own organization at the same time, try to figure out how to support the field and those who were, charged with supporting both our partners or everybody. And it's an interesting time, and I think all of us are really having to make hard choices right now to think about who are we and how are we going to, what's our purpose and reason for being into the future, as again, it looks like this is going to continue, at least for the foreseeable future.
Sure. And, right alongside that comes the murder of George Floyd and the protests that I think have called a lot of things to attention that maybe was already in a lot of people's minds. And this is another thing that it only seems just that Humanities Council would respond, and in some ways I think that, the humanities have been seeding a lot of this work for years. When I see the way that history is being referred to by protesters, why people are having the arguments they're having about public monuments, this is very much a humanities moment that we're having. And we have to figure out the best way to step into that void that's there for an organization and a voice that I think can bring people into more common ground. But it's by no means easy. And of course, we all bring to it the perspectives we have, not just as executive directors, but as staff, as boards. We're being thrown into, I think, the place where we really have always said we wanted to be, which was to be that voice. But now I think it's how do you do that in a really responsive, sensitive way when things continue to unfold and you continue to sort of need to counterpunch? How do you look past that and say, we're going to do this kind of work in a meaningful, long-term way?
Yeah. Yeah. And, as such, you brought up George Floyd and all those kind of issues. I mean, not only are we dealing with the pandemic, but we're also dealing with issues around race and class and income and wealth inequality and all things the pandemic has unsurfaced, and again, even like any other, nonprofit organization out here, trying to figure out how we're going to keep our own lights on at the same time. Mm-hmm. It is a challenge time, but that doesn't mean that we should stop what we're doing and figure out how we can do it better, right? And so one of the things I've been so proud of our staff, frankly, is, I don't know about what when you made the decision in Massachusetts, but we decided to begin working remotely about a week before our governor made the shut down the state, if you will. And so it was late March. And we decided then, Brian, that we had to figure out who we were going to be because our entire business model is based upon face-to-face interaction. Last year, we supported, either as a convener or as a funder, 749 programs all around the state of New Hampshire, right? And those are largely based on this face-to-face model. And so what are we going to do now? And so, that's when we said, well, we're going to have to innovate, and we're going to have to adapt to this changing circumstance. We're going to go virtual. And we're also at the same time not going to shy away from some of the topics, some of the most pressing issues. And for example, that's when we brought forward human ties, started to and launched Black Thought as an example.
So let's talk about Black Thought, because I jokingly, when it came up, you and I talk about music a lot. I know you're a punk rock guy. I've always been a hip hop guy, and I know there's overlap there. And when I heard
the Roots,
I thought it was the longtime frontman MC for the Roots, and you're doing such a great job that I said maybe Anthony got Black Thought to be part of his programming somehow. That's not what you've done, but I think this is an important one to talk about. So tell us about the program, and also I think don't forget to tell people how they might be able to attend one soon too.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, Black Thought is a program that supports kind of our organizational value statement, right? That requires us to, to ensure that our programs, our grants, all of our related opportunities, they're accessible to, and they're done in collaboration with a diverse set of people, right? And actors. But especially the voices of those whose stories have not been fully told or even accurately or told at all, instead, right? Now, interestingly enough, I had the opportunity in January of this year, Rona, if I call it, to participate on a panel with Dr. Dennis Britt. And it was a focus, we were working at the time with Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm.
If you're familiar with that organization, they do some wonderful work based out of Portsmouth, led by Jerry Ann Bogus. You should check them out. And I was there to talk about the importance of place in public art and how it can be leveraged, not for good or for bad, but just how it can be leveraged. And I talk about the importance of monuments as an example and what their intended purpose was. This is for the kind of the pre-monument thing. But I also have to talk about the use of white Jesus and its use in that imagery to support white supremacist thinking, mm-hmm. right? And so we started to have this back thought, and there was a lot of exchange with the folks there in the audience, and there was a lot of interest in the topic. And I talked to my colleagues there, and we thought, well, we think there's a lot of interest in some of these topics, and all this stuff is really bubbling up, and we have an obligation, responsibility to serve the entire state. And although the numbers of Black and brown people are relatively small in the state, that doesn't mean that our stories, or their stories, if you will, are any less important. And if we're going to make our programming accessible too, we got to make sure it reflects our stories other than just a traditional slave story, frankly. Mm. And so we use Black thought because we thought, Black thought can encompass everything. We can talk about art. We can talk about literature. We can talk about dance. We can talk about a whole host of topics, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of set out on this mission to launch this kind of mini-series. And so we launched the first one with Jerry Ann, where we focused on Juneteenth and its importance. Now, just by a sheer stroke of nature, it was on the same week that our current president had talked about hosting his first rally there, and also there in Tulsa. That was followed up by Dr. Dennis Britton out of UNH, who's done a tremendous amount of work on this topic, particularly. And his topic was his subject was my problem with white Jesus, and he looked at again this imagery over the years. And its use to support kind of supremacist thinking. And we followed that up with Dr. Maria Baumgartner, where she looked at disease and death from 1793 and 2019. So when you think about the yellow fever of 1793, a mosquito-borne illness, and what historical implications it has for today, there's quite a lot of parallels there. And so, it was really interesting. I got to tell you, Brian, the interest in this series was extraordinary. On average, we'd have over 150 people log in every Friday from 5 to 6, mm-hmm. To talk about issues and bring light to the things that people may not have understood or maybe had any idea that existed. And it was really interesting. So as such, because of the overwhelming interest, we decided to continue with this because we just wanted to gauge this. So let's do a mini series. We'll call it as such. But now we're going to continue that. And so we'll bring this back in September. And so talking about some of the most relevant images, really the idea here is to bring the Black perspectives to the humanities. Because people like myself who have an interest in this work, we oftentimes don't see our histories reflected or our stories even within the humanities sector. So it's our job to make sure we can be inclusive and equitable in all that we do.
When you go to find the next speaker, the next person to present in that series, tell me how that works. How does that work with you and your staff? Are you looking at past grantees? How do you come up with the next thinker there?
That's a great question because we're in the midst of doing that right now.
Let's do it.
As a matter of fact, got any good ideas?
Lots, yeah.
There you go. So no, in fact, it's really, really interesting. And so, I read something earlier, and I'll read it again. We have to, our programs, grants, and related opportunities are offered by, accessible to, and in collaboration with. And so, I may be a person of African descent, but I reflect my perspective only. And so some of the topics we've been bantering around with some of the conversations that have come in have been issues around, for example, reparations. This is clearly an issue that's bubbled up, and clearly that we want to continue this conversation because we think, again, through the lens of history in particular. And if you notice, most recently, the decision in Asheville, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And if you think about particularly the civil rights movement, it didn't surprise me that decision came out of Asheville, North Carolina. If you think about
decision. Talk about the decision.
If you think about history.
Yeah.
If you think about history. And so, no, it's a really organic process. So it comes from our board, it comes from our staff, it comes from basic, and one of the things we do a lot of, if we can't, so a lot of times, we evaluate everything, right? And so through our evaluations, and we have over 1 out of 2 people who participate in our program and will complete an evaluation. I can't believe it. And we really appreciate the feedback. But it really guides pretty much all that we do when it comes to a lot of our program and related content. Because at the end of the day, again, we have to reflect the interests of our constituents.
Great. You and I talked beforehand a little, just a game showy challenge here before we take some questions. Tell me a book, piece of music, or a place that's really getting you through what is, hey, let's be honest, a very full plate right now.
I thought about this a little bit, right?
I hope so.
You know me and music, man. There's been 2 songs that have gotten me through. A little different, and so for those who don't know me, and those that do know, I'm a huge Mariah Carey fan. I have been since day 1. Vision of Love changed my life. Yeah, I got you, didn't I?
We could have started with this. Okay.
All right. So that being said, if you're familiar with brass tracks, if you're not, Brian, you need to be, right? It's basically horns and percussion. Amazing. They recently released a cover of "Always Be My Baby," one of my favorite tracks. The horn section, mind blowing. Another piece that's kind of got me through, particularly in the morning. I'll run in the mornings. For those who missed the BET Awards, make sure the opening piece was a remake of "Fight the Power" by Public Enemy. Amazing. Place, my garden. My garden.
Yeah.
That's where I'm finding solace right now.
So I see a lot of activity there. Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. So I just harvested some more zucchini. If anybody needs zucchini, let me know. I'll gladly ship you zucchini. Ate my corn today. The critters got to me, but I was able to harvest 2 ears. So that was kind of fun. I'm a city kid. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. You know, there's a little about 1 million people in my city. I never thought I'd garden a day in my life. Little did I know.
Well, actually, now you say that, and thinking about music, and the songs you cited are 20, 25 years old.
I'm an old man.
I think a lot about. I'm not trying to date anybody. What I was thinking more along the lines of, and I've been trying to ask more people this. When I think about how I first started to engage in what we now call the humanities, but then we just called a book someone gave you, or the music you gave you. Even a song like "Fight the Power" was such an education, and there's so much text involved in a song like that, like a rap song, tons and tons of lyrics, and you there as a young person are starting to interpret a piece of art. One that has sort of a journalistic quality. It has a protest quality to it. Certainly growing up where I grew up, it was a foreign quality as well. And I think there's always something off about that fascination, but also like really mind-opening. But I do think about, we talk about entryways to the humanities in all kinds of ways, but actually most of us around the age of 14 or 15 are engaging in some way in a book that suddenly changes the way you think. Or a piece of music that opens up that there may be some other place besides where you are. And I think that way the humanities is a voyage is something we need to talk more about just as a community. So I'm guessing that Mariah Carey was that for you as a kid. But I'm going to push a little bit more and say, like, when you started to really understand that history was something important to you, as you said, and coming from where you come from, can you remember sort of moments in that awakening, I guess?
Well, I absolutely can. And you were talking about our portal into the humanities. So I always had an interest in reading as a kid. I always, for those of you who aren't familiar with Dayton, Ohio, it was the birthplace of Paul Laurence Dunbar. For those of you who are not familiar with his poetry, I encourage you to look into him. He really influenced Maya Angelou quite a bit, and she references him. So he was a contemporary, which doesn't surprise me, with the Wright brothers. They live right down the street on West 3rd Street in Dayton, Ohio. A little local history. By the way, Dayton, Ohio is also the birthplace for Roger Troutman and Zapp and Heatwave. Let's be clear. So it's Funkalicious.
That's a good reference. That's a great reference. Yep.
There you go. It's Funkalicious. Now, for me, my entry was spoken word and poetry through hip hop. You know, had it not been for the native tongue, and for those who aren't, it'd be like Moni Love, Tribe Called Quest, who else? Whole bunch. It was hip hop, and that was my influence.
The native tongues.
Yeah, it was poetry. And then, you know, as a kid, you know, my grandparents were, and the way they thought, Nina Simone was huge for me. Strange Fruit, you know, the imagery that she had in that music, it really shocked me. And the Last Poets, you know, and for those of you familiar with the Last Poets, particularly, and the application of Black arts in the Black Power movement, you know, as a young boy, it really influenced me quite a bit. And so, you know, that imagery, that art, you know, that literature, it really impacted me, and all of that within this space called West Dayton.
Yeah. You know, that is something that I really believe firmly, and why I love this work is I do think there's a sort of spatial concentric engagement you have as a young person with the world, that if you understand those local things, you find that you're connected to larger and larger parts of the world. You know, if you know that within your neighborhood someone is actually globally important, and you learn that first, it starts to tune you into many, many different things. And growing up in Pittsburgh, I've always said there was a little bit of a blind spot because they didn't explain to us, certainly the Black history of Pittsburgh, but even the labor and steel history of it was always behind a shroud. And I always thought that was such a miss, because the more you're engaged at a really young age with what that local history is, I really think that's the way you tune in, you know, and it centers you in a really important way. I'm glad I asked you that question, because I think that proves my point that coming into this field now and into positions of leadership and having those cultural references is going to be, and giving them the place of importance they actually deserve, is going to be really, really vital, I think, as we all try and navigate where we're going.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of transparency, or maybe a bit of honesty. I mean, as a professional, we all struggle with bringing our authentic self to the plate, right? And how much of your authentic self can you reveal? I got to tell you, in my professional career, and you know, I started early. I started working I put myself through college, you know, working at Perkins Pancake House and everything else in between. But it's been, you know, it's been a really interesting position for me as I've taken over the opportunity to help lead this organization, where it's really the first time I feel I can bring my whole self to the plate, where I can bring all of my, you know, my truths to the plate, but I can also bring my myriad of experience across multiple sectors, my appreciation for humanity, and the common good. You know, I think right now the humanities have the more important role. We've heard this time and time again. Oh, there's never more important time than the humanities and right now. Well, I mean, can we think of a more important time than right now, Brian? I mean, let's be real. I mean, you know, the very nature of who we are as a country, I mean, some of us would argue is at stake right now. The things that are tearing us apart, you know, but I think we're stronger than those things that are, but I think we can help. And I think that's why the roles that we play in these states are so important, whether it's our CARES work, whether it's bring the stories of those that need to be told, or it's supporting our teachers, our educators, you name it. There's a lot of work for us to do.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're in this boat together. This is the time when, if anyone has any questions to drop into the chat, we're happy to take them. I'll read them out to Anthony. And do my best to convey your questions.
So am I allowed to ask questions of individuals?
Please do. I hope we can unmute them and let them in.
All right. Let's see, who can I pick? Well, actually, you know what, Brian? Let me ask you a question before I do that, because I don't think that would quite be fair. Let me ask you a question. I mean, as you've gone through this CARES work, you know, as you think about your work from Louisiana up into Massachusetts, you know, and the differences here, and thinking about the different roles we play. I mean, what do you think has been, you know, the biggest lesson you've learned of late, particularly in relationship to whether it be the roles we played in this CARES work, or our need, you know, our kind of foray into this virtual work? I mean,
yeah. Yeah, I think like you, I've learned to appreciate the creativity of my team and to really feel like it needs to be a full-bodied response by the entire organization if we're really going to adapt to this. And I'm encouraged by what I've learned from that. The CARES Act, specifically for me, I think was interesting because, like I said, we got a window into just, as you said, the traditional field. And while I do think it's really important that we keep pushing the envelope to bring more and more people and more organizations and more non-traditional humanities organizations into the fold, I think the light bulb that went off for me was looking at the numbers. You were reading off your percentages. You know, for us, it was about 56% were history museums or historical societies. And that's Massachusetts for you. I mean, we have lots of them and they're excellent. I started to really think about what change was possible from within that infrastructure. That perhaps as a humanities institution, our role is not to go and think that we can necessarily do what the really meaningful work is on a community level to really engage with people that are really outside of this circle. Maybe what we do is we really work with the traditional infrastructure to open the doors much wider, you know, to bring communities into those infrastructure. Because the great thing about Massachusetts is there's one of those in every town, you know, and I believe in them. And I think that they're willing to do that opening. But I think the work of a humanities council, at least in this state to me, as I start to think more and more about it, is how do we do that connecting? You know, how do we serve as that advocate for that kind of integration, I think, of audience and institutions? And CARES really showed me that, I think. And I wouldn't say that that wasn't on my mind, but it really became clear that, man, there's, you know, we gave out 123 grants, you know? It's 123 organizations that want people to come in their doors, you know, and there's histories that need to be told right now, and all the issues you and I talked about. If that architecture is already there, maybe the best thing for my team and I is to go out there and make sure that it gets built up, you know, and that it's strong and it's ready to be responsive to the community needs. And the good thing is we know through our grants program that work's being done. You know, there are institutions that are doing it. How do we get behind that? And that was, you know, making the impact of giving out $572,000 in a really quick amount of time. Fantastic. But that education part, I think, is going to really be formative for us and what we do.
I guess that kind of reminds me of something we were thinking about earlier. You know, it's never, for now, we've kind of adopted this strategy. It's never an either or. It can always, it often is an and.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea is let's focus on our traditional constituencies, right? Because, you know, bird hands were true in the bush as well. But it's also focused on some field building work, while at the same time we're bringing newer people into this work too. And so we one foot into the past and 1 foot into the future. And so, you know, but trying to manage that balance for us has been the fun part, and really the most educational part as well.
Well, and we only have the resources we have, right? But I think to the broad theme here today about how there's not a set track that gets you into leadership in the humanities. The thing we've been talking a lot about is how do we, and I don't always use this term, but how do we disrupt the pipeline? You know, how do we say that we want the stewardship of the public humanities to be much more responsive and reflective of what these communities are throughout Massachusetts? How do we bring up new leaders in the humanities from those communities, and again, get them in sync with those institutions? And I take that challenge really seriously. And again, that's one of those ones where, look, for the humanities, it could be just about anything we could go out and address. You know, we all believe in the work that much. There's not an issue out there we couldn't bring the lens to. But when I think about bringing equity in the leadership in this field, in this robust cultural sector, who's going to do that but us?
No, I agree. And let's go back to how this conversation started. You know, we're both new to our respective positions in our organizations. But at the time, 4 of 6 of us were newer positions in all of New England, right? Yeah, the only 2 that weren't were Rhode Island, if you will, and in Maine. Everybody else is
Anderson and Elizabeth Francis. They've been our elder states people, and they've been there 6-8 years, I think.
Absolutely. So, you know, the reality is that, first of all, I think we have new leadership. But, you know, I mean, to your point about, you know, I think that's a bit of a larger question we can engage in one day, which was, as our constituencies change and frankly, the demographics of our country change, right? Our staff, our boards, our policies, our procedures, there needs to be kind of reflection on
Yeah.
that as well, because they think, frankly, we've not always reflected the change in our local communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to your point about, hey, they've always been there, they've been a long time. Let's build on that. But it's also about identifying the organizations that were also serving other populations that we somehow weren't able to serve,
Right.
maybe because we didn't reflect those stories in our boards, on our staff, and whatever. So, I think there's some other work that, we need to also engage in, so we can not only, again, continue to serve our traditionals, but also bring new people into the work as well.
The first barriers we have to remove are the internal ones. The first walls that have to come down to those. So I'm with you on that. And I think a lot about how do we foster partnerships between, I don't want to set up this dichotomy you and I are talking through, but how do we set up some partnerships there, where those organizations work together? I think that's again, that's not always that's sometimes a thankless task, but it's also a task that is really worth doing. And I'm not sure who else is going to broker that kind of evolution. Speaking of evolution, I have a question here actually from our wonderful director of grants, Catherine Stevens. What's an example of a collaboration that transformed an idea for a program? So we were just talking about partnership. Collaboration is a big part of this work.
Yep. Well, I think one of the things that we've had the most fun with here recently, it's actually extended into this virtual work for us, has been Dr. Pio, and I referenced Tricia before, her work around humanities at work. And so let me give you an example. And so historically, this is particularly pre-Rona, we have our traditional speakers bureau program. You probably have one as well, Brian. And we would, oftentimes our programs would be offered at our local library, historical society. Our speaker would go there, they give their talk for 60 to 90 minutes or so. 30, 40 people would come and gather from the local community, hear a topic, took a presentation, and kind of go back, serve that local community. Well, that's great, but it usually served a particular demographic. And one of the things we noticed, they were oftentimes offered at 6 or 6:30. And so to expect somebody, a working family, somebody who's got a young family like you, who's got kids, and like I had, at 6 or 6:30, you're thinking about feeding your family, maybe getting the homework done, getting them bathed, etc. So in this idea of bringing them out to Muhammad, we launched this idea called Humanities at Work, where we leverage our partnership, say, for example, with New England Delta Dental, as an example, which has been a long-term partner on this work, where we brought our programming into their workplace at noon for lunch and learns. The HR department would purchase sandwiches. They'd have a lunch and learn. They come and we give our presentations there. And it gives us to a population and a demographic that we otherwise wouldn't have access to. Right. So we can broaden the tent in terms of allowing people access into our program. That's a unique partnership that has now transitioned to the virtual world. So now they've asked us to now deliver our programming in the virtual space. That's now what we're doing once a month. And so as we begin to not only leverage our current content, but begin to continue to develop new content and new facilitators through our field building work, right? Our TOT, the trainers of trainers work, and that allows us to develop more content that we deliver virtually now, right? And this is part of our fee for service. So just like you, I don't know about you, but 60% of our budget comes from the NEH. The other 40%, we have to hustle up ourselves, and we don't have any state support, zero, right? And so this is part of our fee for service works that goes to support our bottom line. And so there's an example of a unique program or innovation that was thinking about who do we serve and how do we serve them better? And then how do we leverage this in support of our mission in terms of access? And then now transitioning to the virtual world and thinking about field building as it means. And it's been a really fun experience of late, and it continues to grow and develop over time, which has been nice. That's really cool. It's an opportunity to leverage relationships with non-traditional partners. So, for example, members of the local chamber or our New Hampshire Business and Industry Association, members of those trade groups, get a 25% or 30% reduction on the fee if they want to participate in one of our programming. That way we can make it, it can support our workforce.
This is so cool because one, I have a question from someone who's going to relate to this, but two, I now, we have enough history. I remember when you brought that program online and thinking, wow, that was really smart and a way to, like you said, earn revenue, but then meet a lot of people you wouldn't have met before and have the humanities be front and center where they already are. And I think that seems to me to be a really big characteristic of the work you've been doing, and certainly work that I admire quite a lot. The question we have, it says, if Southern New Hampshire can be viewed as an extension of Northern Mass, do you see any opportunities for our two councils to collaborate on any events or programs?
Well, Brian, I mean, truth be told, you and I have been talking about this since pretty much day one.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I think you and I and others, particularly Chris in Vermont and our folks, we have an opportunity to think regionally, but I certainly believe that to be the case. We've been doing a lot of work right now with, for example, St. A's. St. A's for us, and particularly the Capone Center for the Humanities, right? They, for us, represent our Southern New Hampshire kind of educational hub space. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do, our economic and some of our social and histories are tied together. Think about the Lowell experiment, right? The Lowell experiment in terms of the growth of the basically manufacturing city informed the Manchester experience. And so our histories are tied together already, my brother. So absolutely.
There's something is going to come of all this, and I we've talked about the 250th anniversary of the Revolution coming up, and I think that there's no way New England's not a part of that.
Right.
So I think what's important, and again, I think that's why I'm so glad that people are leading these organizations who are, how to make that an inclusive commemoration. I think we have time to put that together, and I think wheels are turning. So I'm encouraged by this. I'm encouraged by this conversation, as I always am when I get to talk to you. Anthony Poore, Executive Director, New Hampshire Humanities. You can go to nhhumanities.org to learn more about what they're doing, attend one of those programs, follow him at Ant Poore. Thank you, Anthony. I think that we'll end up talking probably within the next week, as we usually do, but this has been really fun, man.
Oh, no, listen, thank you for allowing me to just spend an hour with y'all. I really appreciate it. Anything I can do to be helpful, I would love to. So don't hesitate to reach out, email, phone call, smoke signal, you name it. I'll come a running.
Thank you, sir. We will be posting this on our YouTube page within the next 2 business days, and sending it out on all of our platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and our newsletter, which you can join at masshumanities.org. We're going to be back on August the 5th with Phoebe Stein, who's the new Executive Director of the Federation of State Humanities Councils, who advocates for Anthony and myself and all the humanities councils around the country. So that should be a great conversation. We're here with us to have it. So wishing everybody a good evening, and keep on sticking with the humanities, because we're going to stick with all of you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.